let us begin the last session. And first of all, I'd like to say that today and yesterday I heard for the most time in my life the phrase that thank you very much for the organization and whatever. I'm very glad, but I would like to say thank you to all of you who presented, who chaired, and who was present as audience for making, I feel, a very successful workshop. And the topping on the cake is coming now. Gregory Claeys is going to give the final keynote of the workshop, which will be then followed by question and answer, which develops into a short roundtable discussion, just summarizing what we came up to. Now, Gregory does this commonplace that there's a person who needs no introduction. Obviously, in the end of the two-day workshop, when you met and spoke to, that's probably also true for a lot of people here. But Gregory Claeys, the Professor Emeritus of Royal Holloway University and the chairperson of the Utopian Studies Society, is really one of the doyens of Utopian studies, a historian of ideas, working very often with 19th century, but also other sources, and published a number of important books. The two most recent ones are so heavy that I could only bring one, because I'm not strong enough to bring both of them here. But he was strong enough to write them. The one that's not here, that's called Dystopia Natural History, and whoever is interested in dystopia, really recommend, because that really describes how dystopia is not only a literary or filmic phenomenon, but it's very much in history and the history of ideas. And the most recent book, which I'm also going to circulate amongst you, came out last year, Utopianism for a Dying Planet. This is a fascinating book. I just finished it a couple of weeks ago. I was happy to get a review copy, as it's a fairly expensive book, but Greg told me that you can actually get a 30% discount. We're going to circulate his email address, and if you write to him, then that can be obtained. So this book is a very complex one, once a very interesting and complex description of what utopianism is, and also a history of utopianism in mostly European social thought. And also, the whole thing is in the context of the current climate disaster which we are facing. This is the title, Utopianism for a Dying Planet. So we need to change our ways, especially consumerism needs to be changed. There's a very complex description of what is consumerism like and why is it so dangerous, partly for the planet, but partly also for the happiness of people. We live in wealth compared to the history of mankind. Most of us in Western Europe lives under fantastic conditions, and that doesn't really make us happy, at least not as much as it should. And in this book, Gregory Claeys recommends a way in which we could not only avoid destroying the planet, but also living a happier life. So if that's enough for an introduction, then I will start circulating the book and then ask you to deliver your paper.
Thanks so much, Zol. Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for coming along. And also, I might add, for speaking in English. It's a great pleasure to be back in Budapest, a city I'm very fond of. And I want particularly to thank, of course, having just said that this is now redundant, my Utopian Studies Society colleague, Zsolt Szigany, for inviting me to consider a topic which is central to both the utopian tradition and, of course, as we've heard over the course of the last few days, the entirety of contemporary politics. Its pertinence is indeed now greater than ever. As we speak, some hundreds of kilometers to the east, a vicious dictator is waging a savage war against not only a sovereign people, but against the values of Western liberal pluralism, against the rule of law, the toleration of dissent and minorities, and, of course, against democracy as such. The West has its own domestic dystopian tendencies, some of which I will be discussing shortly. But the combination of ethnic chauvinism, imperialism, and hostility to social liberalism, which characterizes Mr. Putin's image of Russia's mission, clashes so rudely with Western ideas of expanding toleration for minorities and differences in outlook and promoting the maximum choice of values for individual life, that we cannot but see this as the key backdrop to our discussions today. And if we, that is to say, Ukrainians, are fighting for a way of life, we'd better be able clearly to specify what it is we and they are defending. Today, I want to consider several approaches to the issues of democracy and political control in the history of utopianism, which includes utopian ideas, of course, literature, and intentional communities, and to review the development of the often tense relationship between utopianism and democracy. I'll touch on the fundamentally anti-political aspects of the utopian tradition, including the attempt to transcend politics as such, and the charge that the eternal search for near unanimity of opinion is fundamentally anti-democratic. I'll examine then the misinterpretation of utopia, in my view, as perfection, and the optimal role played by consent in utopian relationships. I'll argue that the central theme in the utopian theory of democracy is its insistence on social equality, which we've kind of touched on in a number of papers here. This was what was broadly understood with Thomas More's text as a template as the so-called utopian program by the late 18th century. This phrase is actually used, and it refers directly to More's agenda. I'll also briefly introduce one prominent contemporary anti-democratic utopian trend from the UK. Finally, I'll ask our most important question today, whether we can achieve a consensus in time to avert the catastrophic destruction of our natural environment, and what we can do in the absence of such a consensus. This is a large and complex subject, obviously, and I do not pretend today to do more than to scratch its surface. If I succeed in persuading you that we're at a turning point in its meaning, however, I'll rest satisfied. So let me begin with a key theoretical problem. I assume today that modern utopianism from the American and French Revolution onwards has been chiefly, if not inexorably, democratic in outlook. This is usually taken to be the difference between the pre-modern and modern traditions of utopian writing. Even where it has degenerated into autocracy, as in Stalinism, the tradition has continued to pay lip service to democratic norms and aspirations. Though democracy is often defined in terms of mechanisms, such as constitutions, the rule of law, and the protection of rights, a core aspect of its achievements over the past 2 centuries and more has been its championing of consent and opposition to coercion. These I see as a spectrum. The problem as to whether utopian projects are invariably coercive because they rely on near unanimity of opinion is often recognized to be central to the political theory of the tradition. Indeed, in the more modern period, the prospect is often understood by critics of utopianism as the strongest argument for rejecting at least the more perfectionist strands of the genre, if not the entire project tout court. So it's important at the outset to appreciate that at its best, utopian experimentation, often in small intentional communities, has sought to forge consensus of opinion voluntarily and not coercively. But of course, public opinion can also be a form of coercion, of its the guiding principle in such communities. The distinction between coercion and consent is, however, a difficult one. But we can do worse than to rely on the 19th century British liberal John Stuart Mill's famous harm principle, which establishes that interference in individual behavior is not justified unless actual harm to another is being committed, meaning here principally physical hurt, although Mill's definition is more complicated than that. There are, of course, a variety of problems associated with this principle, but we can see, I think, that it points us in the direction, say, of permitting, as Mill kind of suggests as far as you can in 1859, gay marriage, while condemning domestic abuse or forced marriage. This is a progressive principle, which implies that the 18th century language of rights and the rights project of the French Revolution in particular has been continually extended and implies the constant promotion of maximal individual freedom and freedom from fear in all interactions where no harm to others occurs. This alone, so the argument runs, secures that prized individuality about which the moderns have so often, and quite rightly, boasted. It underpins what is now commonly called a woke agenda in Anglo-American discourse, although this term hardly does justice to the claims for freedom it represents, or it is nothing more than a reiteration of minority rights. And it also now assumes new forms, most notably interference in non-sustainable behavior by tire extinguishers, as they're called. I don't know if you have them in Hungary. Eco-warriors, so-called, who deflate the tires of extremely large cars which are parked in the cities. Environmental demonstrations and protests against meat eating and flying. But amidst the culture wars which swirl around us, it is worth recalling that these rights claims represent the epitome of the struggle which began with the American and French revolutions and continues in Kiev, Kherson, and 1,000 other locations today. This implies, of course, that there can accordingly be no fixed original constitution, which once settled upon dictates all future politics. Since H.G. Wells's A Modern Utopia, the first such text consciously to pit itself against the entire utopian tradition and to proclaim that it's informed by a particular definition of modernity. And in the light of Darwin was, of course, a major component in this claim. Since this point onwards, at least, we've learned that utopia cannot be static. It must grow as society grows in the direction of greater toleration and individuality, and as I will today argue, also sustainability. Where such claims jar with tradition, as they invariably must, conflict obviously will result. But we must in turn acknowledge the moral superiority of greater inclusivity as a key feature of human progress. Traditions of repression are not traditions worth preserving. Utopias which rely upon subordinating any part of the population, whether based on race, gender, or other differentiation, cannot satisfy this demand for universality. Remember, there's still imperialism and slavery in Thomas More's Utopia. So while any experiment aiming to create an ideal society might empirically be called a utopia, none which relies on oppressing or exploiting any group would today meet this normative definition. Welcome to the 21st century. So let me turn secondly to the problem of authoritarianism in more traditional forms of utopianism. Many classical and early modern utopias have been authoritarian, imperialistic, even theocratic. The concept itself offers no guarantee of transparent or popular political institutions. In the West, the tradition commences with a reliance on philosopher kings, guardians, and experts of various kinds. Elite rule remains a leitmotif until we reach the age of democratic revolutions in the late 18th century. As we all recognize, however, oligarchies invariably emerge wherever a great disparity of property ownership exists. So whether you call a society a democracy politically or not, if there's great inequality of property ownership, it's a democracy in name only, because property will always tilt the balance in favor of the property owners. So from Thomas More's Utopia onwards, there emerges a new theory of democracy in the form of a tradition of utopian republicanism, as I call it, where social equality based on communal property ownership permits much more democracy than elsewhere. Here, rule by the idle and luxury-obsessed rich, like the sheep barons destroying the peasantry of 16th century England, who were More's target, has been replaced by an entirely new form of government, in which so-called cyphogrants are elected annually as administrators of 30 households, with phylarchs in charge of every 10 cyphogrants. The latter collectively number 200 in More's scheme and elect the chief executive who serves for life by secret ballot from amongst 4 candidates, while guarding carefully against any lapse into tyranny. So it's a form of indirect democracy, but nonetheless, it's recognizably democratic. During the ensuing 500 years, many other political schemes have been attached to utopian social and economic programs. Although the American and French revolutions represent a crucial turning point in rendering participatory representative democracy the characteristic modern ideal, utopians have, of course, never ceased to complain of the corruption attending elections and the mediocre quality of political candidates. The main form of modern utopianism, socialism, has sometimes viewed democracy merely as just another source of conflict, and occasionally sought to abolish elections entirely. In Robert Owen's case, for example, in favor of a gerontocratic scheme of rule by age group, which assured that everyone would eventually become a governor of the community of 2,000, 2,500 or so that they lived in, simply by growing to the requisite age of being in the governing group. Many smaller communities have also relied on small group dynamics to ensure general social conformity. Christian communities often relying on charismatic leaders and patriarchal elders. Often described as the first major democratic utopian literary author, H.G. Wells devised a scheme based on Plato to give a voluntary ruling group, the entirely public-minded samurai, as he calls them in the modern utopia, a key role in the new up-and-coming world state. The Communist Party, which Wells admired for a time as a kind of guardian group, came to play a similar role in Marxism-Leninism. Marx himself, of course, was a fairly traditional Democrat who also assumed that harmony could be achieved at the level of the nation state, not just the small-scale community. That's the most important shift that occurs in the 19th century in this area. And of course, for Marx and Lenin, following Saint-Simon, political progress eventually entails the so-called withering away of the state and its replacement by administration and management, as if society were a grand machine in need only of occasional oiling and repair. A scheme which also has echoes in the most successful literary utopia of the 19th century, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards of 1888, where there are, as Bellamy puts it, no parties or politicians, and the principal function of administration is economic. This naive ideal, however, only serves to disguise politics, seen as a conflict of social choices and agendas, as anyone who's ever lived in a notionally socialist society knows all too well. Yet its suggestion that the future society would reduce coercion, especially class-based coercion, is also a fulfillment of democratic promise. And in William Morris's Views from Nowhere, to give another example, this promise seems fully developed, without the guiding role of an elite assumed by Bellamy or Wells. So let's now consider briefly the argument that democracy and utopianism are incompatible because of the high degree of consensus, even unanimity, which utopian harmony purportedly demands. This was, of course, a common argument in the 1930s, being often associated with Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, begun in 1938, and in Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom of 1944. The argument has been restated by J.L. Talmon in a well-known pamphlet called Utopianism and Politics, which was published in 1957. So here's Talmon's rendition. Utopianism postulates free self-expression by the individual and at the same time, absolute social cohesion. This combination is only possible if all individuals agree. All individuals, however, do not agree. Therefore, if you expect unanimity, there is ultimately no escape from dictatorship. The individual must either be forced to agree, or his agreement must be engineered by some kind of fake plebiscite, or he must be treated as an outlaw or traitor or counter-revolutionary subversive. Here, utopia means the best possible society, which clearly rests on having experts run things. But democracy frequently expresses complete disdain for experts. We've heard a bit about this also earlier today, in favor of the popular will and opinion. So this argument briefly is, if you want utopia, you don't need democracy. And if you want democracy, you'll never get utopia. The argument has been used forcefully, particularly from the followers of this school, against all forms of planned economy for many decades. I need to return to that at the end today. One brief partial answer to this narrative, however, is that utopianism is often confused with perfectionism, but is not guilty as charged. As George Orwell expressed it, the real answer to this problem is to dissociate socialism, I'm quoting, from utopianism. Nearly all neo-pessimistic apologetics consist in putting up a man of straw and knocking him down again. The man of straw is called human perfectibility. This means that if the essence of utopian economics and politics is planning, as H.G. Wells most notably claimed, we cannot presume that all planning leads us down the slippery slope to serfdom. Rights must necessarily defend us from overzealous bureaucrats as well as from each other. The avoidance of harm, again, is a first principle here. So let me now go back then to the issue of whether there is an intrinsic coercion in communitarianism in particular. I'm trying, as you can see here, to address all three faces or dimensions of the tradition. Utopians nearly always insist on creating a more powerful sense of community, and one, moreover, where behavior is regulated by norms as much as by laws. If not perfectionist, this demands a high standard of morality in everyday relations. Paradoxically, this may call for a greater degree of informal social control than many modern societies often demonstrate. So we should not treat the problem of coercion only at the level of the nation state. Small-scale communities, about which we've heard a bit in the last 2 days, are in many ways the essence of aspirations to realize utopian ideals. And they reveal much more clearly how the psychology of consent operates. But all communities, large and small, rely on formal and informal restraints on behavior at the micro-political level. Moral suasion or pressure is present in all societies in some form. Whether we tell people off for throwing litter on the ground, chastise those who shout loudly on the train, or draw attention to those who accost women or other vulnerable groups. This is everyday politics in the public space. Such interventions are, by and large, most of the time, laudable and not illiberal attempts to maintain social order and justice, which rely on a kind of social consensus, which is often weakened in more individualistic societies and, of course, in great cities in particular. Moreover, it is clear that we cannot achieve what is, to my mind, if not the central aspect of utopian aspiration, what I call in this book, belongingness. Zusammengehörigkeitsgefühl, for German speakers, is a much more expressive description of the feeling itself. The sense of being a part of one's milieu and of identifying with a place without permitting such interference in everyday antisocial behavior, and an expression of care for the well-being of others or kindness in public. This is most effective when the most basic forms of group which define our identity are minimized in size as far as possible, so that we can know and identify many people around us. This is the secret which unlocks the successful intentional communities in particular. In cities, where a great many of us live, this means reinforcing a sense of place and neighborhood above all, which is why proposals for the so-called 15-minute city championed by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, where health and sports facilities, affordable shops, and cool parks are within walking distance, need to be augmented and expanded. This would allow most of us to establish a primary local identity, bounded by, I propose, many more communal festivals and hospitality, digital groups with which we can identify local democratic and other forms of association, and all variety of mutual assistance. These are essential components in any modern utopia, which must, I don't have time to expand upon this, be an urban utopia. Local, immediate, personal experience is where the micro-politics of everyday life are played out. And paradoxically, of course, the social regulation of behavior must be accompanied at the same time by an ever-increasing tolerance for all types of lifestyle which present no violation of the harm principle. So let me turn now to the issue of equality and the claim that Morean utopianism, utopian republicanism, as well as any successful scheme for equal rights, relies on social equality. Whatever its satirical elements, there's no end of debate about this, More's text represented a real protest against greedy landowners, for which today read billionaires and multinational corporations. We all recognize that the pervasive, corrosive system of modern political corruption results principally from the influence of lobbyists' dark funding in order to ensure that private profit triumphs over public welfare. Without complete financial transparency in governance and prohibiting large donations, possibly all donations, to political parties, we will end up with oligarchies no matter how we describe the form of government under which we live. In More's state, such corruption is simply impossible because the public owns and controls the means of production. Moreover, both housing and work allocation are subject to redistribution. Concentration of wealth is therefore not a problem, and certainly not the problem that it is for us. Suffice it to say today that the more egalitarian a society is, the less likely it is to fall victim to such political corruption. We need not embrace Marx in order to appreciate that the happiest societies, those which are most carefully studied, tend to be the ones with the highest standard of living, not the others where other standards apply, are invariably the most equal societies. Holland, the Nordic countries, Iceland, and so on. And the unhappiest, routinely in every annual survey, Britain and the United States, I don't know where Hungary sits in this scheme, are invariably those which give greater priority to the individual, often meaning the wealthy, over the broader society as a whole, and punish the poor with cruelty and contempt, something the British are very good at. So let me turn now then to what is really the rationale for the whole argument here, the looming collapse of the natural world around us. These generalities, which I've offered so far, have been key arguments favoring more social democratic, welfare-oriented regimes since at least the mid-20th century. However, we now live in a much altered and more threatening era. Let me turn accordingly to the climate catastrophe and collapse, no longer change or crisis. I don't like either of these last two terms, which looms before us. On my reading, as I've outlined in this book, much of the debate concerning what we face is wholly inadequate. Vague goals of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming appear almost every day in the newspapers, while $1 trillion annually is given in fossil fuel subsidies to ensure that we surpass any acceptable limit on global warming. So, unsurprisingly, emissions continue to rise, no matter how many meetings we have, no matter how many agreements we have, no matter how many demonstrations we go to. The 1.5 degree notional ceiling, which is really a kind of sketch figure from the back of an envelope, which was never very meaningful because it's much too high, of course, will likely be passed by the mid-2020s. So that's within only 3 or 4 years. It already has been in some locations. As you know, warming on the Earth is quite variable, and in the polar areas, it is up to 5 degrees Celsius in some parts. At 2 degrees Celsius warming, by perhaps the mid-2030s, most of our agriculture will disappear, and in a few years, mass starvation will eventually kill 90%, perhaps even all, of the world's population. So think where we are now, with only 1.25 to 1.3 degrees Celsius warming. Think of the shrinking Rhine, the Danube, the Po, the Colorado, the Ganges, the Mississippi, the Yangtze. Think of the polar ice caps and the world's glaciers. We've lost 28 trillion tons of ice in the last 23 years. Fossil fuel use is the key chief cause of this entire process. And behind that lies the overconsumption of the world's resources. Fossil fuel corporations, of course, were well aware of this eventuality as early as the 1970s. So that's to say, half a century ago. And now, as we know, the latest from this week, we may be headed for 5 or even 7 degrees Celsius warming, and there are some estimates which even go above that. But above 3 degrees, all this is, for practical purposes, not really thinkable anyway. So this process has to be halted and then reversed. This is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. There is the whole of human history up till about the last 4 or 5 years, and there is everything that comes before us. And between is a rupture, a chasm of dramatic proportions. Can we achieve the transition to sustainability democratically? And what does utopia have to do with the solution? So obviously, the answer to these questions is not simple. Governments and corporations have fixed timetables for elections and profit returns, for graft and self-advancement. They have little awareness of or interest in the need to safeguard our collective long-term future. Only the specter of catastrophe will awaken the majority, but the intense fear and anxiety this will generate may well come too late. As soon as possible, however, a new internationally coordinated regime must cease fossil fuel extraction and inhibit dramatically all forms of warming until we achieve sustainability. So we have to slam our feet on the brakes of this entire process. The utopian component in the solution will lie chiefly in the greater social equality, which will follow reducing consumption and abolishing the billionaire class. We need actually most of the world's wealth in order to ensure a safe transition to sustainability. It's a back of the envelope calculation, at least $300 trillion minimally. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes. The utopian contribution will also lie in the awareness that as we climate-proof our cities in particular, we can create vibrant green living spaces with free public transport, subsidized food, reduced working hours, and a sense of neighborhood and belongingness, which will help to compensate for diminished consumption. It's really the central argument in my book is that if we want to ease this transition, we have to make life better for the majority. And what the utopian tradition teaches us is that actually across most of human history, we value sociability, our relations with each other, much more than we value the possession of material goods. So that's the exchange we're looking for here. If we do not improve life for the majority, I think, during the transition to sustainability, we will not survive. Thus, we stand poised on the precipice of an entirely new era, defined by death, by excessive consumption of what have usually been called luxuries. No utopia, and for that matter, no social or political theory, which has not come to terms with luxury, can suit the future before us. So we need, as I've tried to do in the book, to ransack the whole of intellectual history to find out who has addressed what's now usually called the luxury debate and what kinds of responses they've come up with, which can serve the purpose of saving us now. The desire for luxury drives excessive consumption, which in turn produces excessive carbon and other emissions. So if we don't curtail our desire for merely symbolic and or merely gratuitous consumption or conspicuous consumption, we cannot possibly survive. All of the alternatives are deeply dystopian. The politics of the future, then, will have to adjust to this scenario. In the first instance, as I've already suggested, a massive coordinated international effort to introduce sustainable energy across the world will require the creation of organizations whose scope, as H.G. Wells in particular anticipated, will exceed that of the United Nations. International agreements will have to secure the rapid introduction of wind, solar, tidal, and other renewable power sources, a vast improvement in energy efficiency, and an end to coal and oil. And this can be done. This is not impossible at all, provided we get on with it. Beyond this, a vast network of water canals, drainage, and storm overflow reservoirs will be required, along with massive desalination projects across the globe. The small state ideal, beloved of billionaires, is gone. This will involve interventionism on a scale never before anticipated. We have, therefore, a social goal or common purpose, a collective aim of the sort which Hayek's and other neoliberals denied was even possible in theory. The economy of the 2020s, 30s, and 40s then will look like a wartime planning regime based on urgent environmental necessity. We can already anticipate measures of planning, austerity, and rationing as food and water supplies become dangerously imperiled, starting this year, last year or this year. But this radical Green New Deal, as it's sometimes called, which can alone forestall complete catastrophe, will also require the participation and consent of billions. Everyone must feel that they play a part in preserving nature, whether by embracing voluntary simplicity, a well-known phrase, by assisting in rewilding and similar schemes, or by acting at the neighborhood level to try to preserve some dignity in life as we swelter under an increasingly relentless sun. It goes without saying that this plan will entail sacrifices upon large parts of the population and will, at least initially, be regarded as coercive and authoritarian by those who lack any sense of the dire alternative. We'll have to stop eating beef. 80% of agricultural land is devoted to livestock. We'll be flying a great deal less until fully electric planes are operational. It's not very far off either. Private car use will need to give way to as much public transport, not just electric cars. Deforestation has to cease. All forms of emission must be reduced until the warming process begins to subside, which, even if we put all this into motion tomorrow, wouldn't be for a number of decades. To compensate, however, many public activities, including national transportation, will need to be free. And neighborhoods, this is already occurring in a number of areas, Luxembourg, parts of Spain, some parts of the US. And neighborhoods will need to be remodeled along the lines of the 15-minute city concept I mentioned earlier. Working hours will have to be reduced through the 4-day work week, early retirement, wages secured through a universal basic income. Unless we buy the goodwill of the public through these bribes, essentially, through making the average person's life better, and promote kindness in addition as a social ethos instead of treating the poor as a pariah, we will not win this war. Seen from this perspective, the central concept which the utopian tradition has approached more successfully than any other intellectual trend is that of luxury. From its inception in Thomas More's text, where children mock ambassadors clad in gold, and in hundreds of communitarian experiments, utopianism has recognized the corrosiveness of mere vanity of apparel and the psychological degradation of enslavement to fashion. This contempt for excessive personal adornment, to an important degree, defines the entire tradition, at least until we reach the era of the shift from an emphasis on private luxury and the degenerative effects of it to the benefits of public luxury, which occurs in Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward in particular. Utopian fiction, theory, and literature have alike recognized the unhappiness which results from an obsession with luxury, and have often evinced a Spartan tradition of austerity, asceticism, and primitivism. If we go back to the classical sources, Plato and Sparta loom very large over the entire utopian tradition, at least right up through the middle of the 20th century. But it would be easiest to move beyond growth to degrowth if, in addition to this tradition of austerity and asceticism, we follow the great French socialist Charles Fourier in preserving and promoting, indeed, to the maximum, as much pleasurable activity as possible, always bearing in mind that the harm principle can't be violated. It'd be unrealistic, however, not to recognize that public debate today includes other utopian visions starkly at odds with those I've championed so far. Let's consider momentarily one well-known instance of far-right utopianism, which has been popularized by Peter Thiel, a friend of Elon Musk, and a great enemy, in particular, of Britain's National Health Service. Thiel champions the view that democracy and capitalism are incompatible, and you guess which one plumps for, and claims that the book that's influenced him the most is a work co-authored by James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg, published in 1999, called The Sovereign Individual, The Coming Economic Revolution, How to Survive and Prosper in It. Well, so how to prosper by environmental catastrophe, we might rewrite the title today. This is a special instance of that species of late capitalist utopianism known as libertarianism, the extreme small state ideal, where the near demolition of democratic and legal workers' protections and welfare and public services, so-called nanny state, permits a maximization of corporate profits with minimal or non-existent taxation. It has a variety of antecedents in the utopian tradition, most notably in Robert Nozick, William Godwin, and to some degree also in the egotistical anarchist writer Max Stirner. So Davidson and Rees-Mogg typically argue that taxation will effectively end in this new regime. Sovereign individuals, as in the title of the book, the top 5% of society, will increasingly have no obligation to society at all. They will be outside the social contract. They are defined by their superior intellect as well as, of course, their wealth, and they will maximize profits according to the idea of natural justice that is presented here. A similar antagonist is democracy, which is regarded in the book as the fraternal twin of communism. This elite's accumulation of wealth becomes the sole rationale for all social action. But in this incarnation of social Darwinism, because that's sort of what it is, its successes are seen as all owing to merit and to being the most talented. Though, as we know, of course, the vast majority of very rich people inherit a substantial part of wealth and get wealthier as a result of that. The virtual death of politics, as the book puts it, and its replacement, by the so-called commercialization of sovereignty, provides a model which fits the Silicon Valley and St. Petersburg oligarchs alike. But if civilization is ending, there is yet much value to be extracted from and during its demise. The few can protect themselves. With the disappearance or fragmentation of national sovereignty goes the protection of civil order, the police and national armies, and their replacement by private armed forces. So let me draw to a conclusion then. These thoughts are exhausting and depressing too. You may well wonder, from what I've said so far, how it might be possible to extract utopia from the specter of dystopia staring us in the face, to pull out of the apologies to rabbit owners, to pull the utopian white rabbit out of the hat in order to magically usher in utopia in the face of so much dystopia. And another way of phrasing this, of course, is how to preserve democracy in the face of what is clearly incipient or rising fascism in very many parts of the world. My own vision, obviously, is directly opposed to that of The Sovereign Individual, the book. I've argued today that the sense of human fulfillment for which utopianism contends can only be realized when full participation in our societies occurs, and that this requires political democracy, albeit, of course, with the assistance of experts. Here, once again, I follow George Orwell in assuming that the real objective, I'm quoting here, of socialism is not happiness. Happiness is a byproduct, and for all we know, may always remain so. But the real objective of socialism, says Orwell, is human brotherhood. A quote with which I begin, amongst others, this book. So my own view is that only if this utopian ideal of brotherhood is improved on, can we compensate for those austerities, anxieties, and insecurities, which we will certainly face in the coming decades. Without utopia, there's no guarantee of anything but corporate enslavement and fascism as the future world order. If we fail to act, we face the most dire consequences. But we can make a world in which we not only survive, but live with greater fulfillment than most of us do, even the affluent ones, in this world. It is one thing to desire utopia. It's quite another to have its necessity for the first time thrust upon us. This also is the difference between living now in the 2020s and the whole of human history beforehand. Now we have to have utopia. It was a very pleasant alternative or choice up to now in human history, but now it's the only alternative for us. Is this the best possible world we might conceive? No. Far from being a perfect society, however, it may be, as Barbara Goodwin and Keith Taylor termed, the best of all possible worlds in the circumstances. The best available world for a planet being destroyed by humanity. This must be a sustainable world in which personal consumption is at a far lower level than at present. But just think back to what life was like before, say, 1800 for the vast majority. This can be achieved without communism, in case you were thinking, advocating that, though it will require highly centralized control over production and distribution, as well as I suggested earlier, the confiscation of all of the wealth of the extremely wealthy. Such control, in turn, in principle, will still involve coercion, even in the most ideal utopian democracy. But such coercion can be adjusted according to the best interest of the world, namely sustainability, not the interest of the dominant economic class or any other elite. A vital means of ensuring a counterbalance will be the neighborhood-centered model, which may allow us to preserve some of the most vital aspects of both secular and religious utopian communitarianism. Without this sense of place, I think, but I come from a very peripatetic background. This is one of the reasons why I think I place so much emphasis on this. An emotionally satisfying life is impossible. If an extremely unequal system gives us extremely destructive emissions, only a more equal system centered on local consent can distribute the austerities which the transition to sustainability requires. This equality alone permits us to preserve democracy, not to mention public order and meeting our daily needs. We'll be very fortunate indeed to attain this degree of sustainability. So let's try to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you didn't have a feeling for reading this book, and now that you learned that there are such words in it as Zusammengehörigkeitsgefühl, I'm quite sure you want to grab it. I have a list if you want to loan me. But time for questions, comments.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much. It's really great and inspiring. So and learned a lot. So I just would like to make a kind of historical point, something which came to my mind when you mentioned the problem of consent and coercion. Something that I'm very much interested in, and then the notion about the brotherhood. So the historical point is that so this whole problem reminds me a bit of someone who I don't think you mentioned, maybe I wasn't attentive enough, but there is the old Jean-Jacques Rousseau issue about the volonté de tous and volonté générale. And the idea is that you know, one may say that Rousseau so clearly that the only way to achieve consent among civilized humans, forget about the old days, okay? So civilized human is to introduce and internalize a kind of common aim, which is against every single agent's interest. So, and I think ever since Rousseau, there is this kind of fear that he's right, actually. So if you really want to have a orientation around, let's put it a common aim for the community that entails, given the conditions, given the human conditions in which we live, it entails oppressing each of us singular desires or aims or something like that. Okay, so this is one of the question or comments I would like to make. So how would you respond to this challenge? Because I think that's still the deepest objection to the idea of this kind of community. And of course, Rousseau liked it, but the idea is that other people say, oops, this is more of a, if you are right, that's more of a danger. It's more of an argument against you than an appealing character here. Okay, so that's one. And the other thing is the notion of brotherhood. So this concept, so one, and this is mainly conceptual, so this is to do with how it's being used by philosophers, politicians, writers, writers. So this is so the problem, I think, with this kind of very appealing concept like friendship to use in a political context seems to me that they are by nature exclusive. So if I have a friend, and if I meet a stranger, and a friend asks me to help, and I have limited resources, okay, and there is a stranger, and I say, I'm sorry, we are all brothers, so I will, I will rather, I don't know, I toss a coin, I'd rather have the stranger, then there is no more friendship. It's just, by definition, exclusionary. And I think brotherhood is also, seems to be something like that. And if we extend the notion so much that, it's become universal, or even universal even in the restricted sense that applied to everyone in my community or something like that, even then, it seems to lose its original content. And it just means something like fairness or respect the other or something like that. So I wonder how much weight this notion of brotherhood can play in a political vision future. Sorry, maybe I was too long.
No, not at all. Thank you for such penetrating and interesting questions. Rousseau, of course, to go back to the first question, Rousseau is, of course, one of the great utopian figures of the modern world. Judith Shklar describes him essentially as the last great utopian in the Spartan vein. He's, of course, a republican of sorts. And it's curious that on the political theory side of utopian studies, everybody knows this. On the literary side, although Rousseau's the author of many novels, he doesn't really appear in the canon of utopian greats at all. So to paraphrase, instead of forcing people to be free by the general will, we force them to survive, because we do have here a common interest, which is in everyone surviving, which is why I think one of the single most dangerous ideas that's now circulating is the notion that Thiel and others have circulated, in particular of the colonization of space as a way for billionaires, masochists associated with attempts of this kind. The notion that a very few people can escape, which many people then take to presume, will mean that others can then go along as well, and that there is, so to speak, an escape valve. We won't all be exterminated. Excuse me. I don't think there's anything in this whatsoever. I mean, not only can Mars not be colonized, billionaires will never get it together for a few of them to go. And even if a few survive in the lonely outposts of the Himalayas or the Rockies or whatever, they're not going to survive for very long. And the quality of life they're going to have will be so miserable that those few decades will not be worth living anyway. So there is no escape. So we are actually all in it together. If that's not the basis for a theory of common interest, I don't know what is. So coercion, yes, still present, but of course you'd probably retort, all democracy is based on the coercion of minorities by majorities anyway. So this kind of coercion, we've already kind of baked into the theory of how even the best forms of democracy work. The trick, of course, is to get greater toleration for those who end up as minorities recurrently by the majority, and to ensure, it's where the language of rights, of course, comes in so much, to ensure that those minorities don't suffer unduly by never becoming the majority at a given time. So the second question is also very tricky. I have a fairly lengthy section in the book about types of association and the possibilities of universalizing particular types. And I directly address what you've raised as the question about friendship. Friendships do have to be limited, almost by definition. So I first of all I move from the most powerful forms of association to the least binding. So I start with love. Of course, the Christian ideal of universal association is based on the concept of love. Friendship comes close behind that, but there are many different forms of friendship. Most don't require the levels of emotional intensity and intimacy that we associate with the concept of love. And we can then move down to the lesser levels of association based upon mutual self-interest, cooperation, mutual aid, self-help, whatever you want to call it, which involve very little emotional closeness as such, but do give us that sense of personal reinforcement, as well as the ability just to get on with our everyday lives, that we wouldn't have if they weren't present. So I quoted Orwell, but I'm not actually subscribing to this specific theory in my book for exactly the reasons that you indicate, because I think, like love, and you cannot govern the world with the principle of love, you also can't govern the world with the principle of friendship. The small neighborhood identity approach that I've taken here involves us knowing, maybe, and I've taken this obviously from theories of so-called intentional communities as well, of knowing within our immediate group, maybe 1,500, 1,000, 1,500 people, 2,000, which is pretty much the number of faces that we can recognize, and knowing amongst them perhaps 150 people relatively closely. Psychologists have come, Robin Dunbar, his work, have come up with this number. But the type of association which we have there is what I describe under the sense of belongingness. So we have, I know you because you live in my apartment block or you live down the road. We both shop in the same place. We may meet on the train or on the bus. I know you because you're a member of my neighborhood unit. If you live there long enough, I probably will not really recognize your face, but I'll get to know your name and so on. This builds what the old literature in Utopianism used to call the sense of community. And that sense of community is an extremely important kind of anchor in trying for us to withstand the buffeting winds of everyday life. Excuse me, that will simply get worse and worse. The backdrop to all this is that we have to realize that our everyday lives are going to get tougher and tougher and tougher as the decades loom. You know what the temperature in southern Spain is today, 39 degrees. There are heat waves in many other parts of the world already. We're likely this year break all the European records. And we're not going to stop at 45 degrees, and we're not going to stop at 50 degrees. Above 50, our whole infrastructure is starting to decay. So set that against the ideal type of how we should associate with one another. This is, in the very first instance, mutual assistance against the effects of the degradation of the environment. So in the first instance, it's about water supply, it's about planting trees, it's about making our everyday existence in the city, which is the only scenario I think that's viable for a later modern utopian ideal, but making that existence as comfortable as possible.
Thank you.
Maybe you go first in the back and then Diana.
To keep on this idea of the sense of community, you mentioned that we get more pleasure from socialization than from consumption, but community most of the times, or a lot of times, revolves a lot around food, just like we were having lunch now. And I have been involved in vegan activism for the past, 10 years. I see the need to reduce meat consumption, not only, particularly because I'm against violence against animals, but if we are talking about climate change, climate emergency, climate crisis, then for that reason as well. But what happens in this discussion, most times I feel like we are disenfranchising people. We are, when we bring up this idea, the sense of community breaks instantly. And then you hear, oh, they are trying to take away our burgers. We will no longer have barbecues for celebrations. How can we make this discussion more productive is something that I struggle with, because otherwise it's just like a lifestyle. I do that every day and I feel happy with myself, but how can I do this as a community without blaming people who are not part of it, or without excluding who doesn't enroll to this kind of thinking, even though I think it's urgent to make this change?
It's a very tough question, isn't it? Before we can create the sense of community, we have to have a consensus around the values that will allow us to transition to sustainability. So we have to be able to tell meat eaters and frequent flyers and people who drive enormous Land Rovers in the city that this is just harming our efforts to ensure collective survival. It won't be done easily without, as you've abundantly testified yourself. This entire agenda is going to raise a huge amount of commotion amongst people who are pretty much like ourselves in particular, the most privileged 1, maybe 5% at most in the world, who will have to give up the most because the other 95 or 99% don't have all this stuff to start with. So they're not having to give up much, but we have to give them something too. So it's a rocky road to defining a collective sense of sustainability without doubt. What's crucial here are two other factors that I didn't have a chance to talk about. First of all, we have to have governors who are on board with the scheme, essentially. So we have to have people who are sensible enough, well-read enough, wise enough to look at the projections beyond the 4 or 5 year political cycle, to look at the charts of increasing emissions, to look at the charts of temperature rise, and then to look 15, 20, 30 years into the future and to say, okay, this is absolutely right. We either stop these emissions now or we face a future which is absolutely and completely dire. Linked to that is the press. So I live in the UK where the press is dominated by right-wing billionaires who make fun of people like you and me all the time. I mean, it's just a kind of joke, isn't it? And they like to antagonize those who are involved in environmental protests and so on. The government curtails our right to protest constantly as well. So if you haven't got reasonably sane governors and you haven't got a public press, now this might be engineered in some circumstances by social media rather than the traditional forms of print media, television, and so on. But if you don't have those two separate teams on side, the odds of doing this in time are very much reduced. Now, personally, I think, as I kind of suggested in the talk, we will eventually act because it will be clear if my future scenario is the correct one. It will eventually be clear that we face annihilation. And when the penny drops, there is going to be absolute chaos and panic across the board. And I mean, mass suicides. We're already seeing now people not marrying, not having children, and so on. There is an underlying vague sense of climate anxiety, which is almost omnipresent through the entire population. But at the same time, even people who feel this anxiety are constantly in denial about it. So I guess what I would say in a way to your question is the first thing we have to do is to vocalize what we think is going to happen. And then to vocalize what we think, as with veganism, are appropriate solutions to this. And we have to eventually get everybody on side. But it's not going to be done simply through a consensus of public opinion. There isn't time. If we had 2 centuries or so, it's like population growth, which needs to be curtailed too. If we had 2 centuries or so more to go, we could, quite reasonably expect that the natural outcome of social demographic trends is for populations to flatten out and then even slightly or even more than slightly to decline. But we don't have 2 centuries now. We don't really even have 2 decades. So it's a really important question. I'm sorry I can't give you a more straightforward answer to it. Because debate, criticism, antagonism is a part of the whole process. I mentioned the tire extinguishers, of course. I don't know. Do you have them in Budapest? No. Okay. Well, they're coming soon to a car park near you. Because they are active in, I know of groups in at least half a dozen European societies already, and they're becoming more active. It's a very strong symbolic statement. By the way, they don't puncture the tires, of course. They just let the air out and they leave a note explaining that cars with this level of emission shouldn't be driven in big cities. I mean, it's one thing if you're a farmer and you 4-wheel drive and you've got to transport pigs or whatever. To have a car that sits, kind of this high with the driver up here, to take your children to school in the suburbs is ridiculous. And cars are a very important symbol, of course, because they kind of stand for one of the ways in which we've expressed our sense of freedom and our sense of individuality since at least the end of the Second World War. And because we faced very stark personal choices as a result of it. So.
Okay, first Darina and then Luisa from online. So Darina, please.
Yeah, my question / comments, and I just want to say as a short disclaimer that of course I don't want to live on a decaying planet. But you mentioned about this organization that is going to be is going to have much more capacity than the UN to enforce things, and it's quite you said it is quite achievable actually, and here of course, as a Ukrainian, it's no secret that we are not fans of the UN, and the recent leaks and the reaction of Gutierrez has proven so far that they actually know that how much we don't like them. But the thing is, it's I don't know. It's very. It seems even to us, though it's very impotent organization as we see it. It still would be impossible to dismantle it on one hand, and on the other hand, how can we even create an organization that can enforce actually something if the very first thing and you basically learn in IR is that it's essentially a chaos, and that the problem on the international arena is that nothing can be ultimately enforceable because who's the ultimate enforcer? And that's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question, which I thought of, would be how do we convince people to pay immediate attention, especially in situations where you see. I mean, I come from a country at war, so of course that is as a question in itself already. But then if we see all sorts of protests, we see all sorts of more emergent societal upsets, it's more and then you come to people I don't know, for example, this recent news from Sudan where the biological laboratory was taken over, and now there's a huge risk, and actually from Ukrainian war the same thing with the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and the fact that the Chernobyl was occupied for some time and quite a bit disturbed, and a bunch of national preserves are occupied and wildlife is suffering and the ecocide is quite a big discussed thing. And yet, of course, for the country where there's more immediate concerns, and such immediate concerns arise worldwide every day. Of course, not everywhere it's war, but something substantial. So how do we convince people kind of to, because the biggest problem with the climate change debate is that we don't see it that far, as you said, that we're only going to be acting once the situation becomes so dire that it's going to be impossible to ignore. So how do we convince the countries that are like in the state where it's not prudent maybe to a lot of people to think about these kind of things? Because there was a very interesting case on when on Twitter, a very young and kind of naive user asked, why aren't the soldiers in the trenches not recycling? And of course, no, that was a serious question. And she said that was too dirty, and like this, we are not. I mean, we are not. Russians were civilized. Why are we not recycling? And of course, the people on the front lines were quite amused by that comment. But and this kind of shows on that there are more pressing concerns, and obviously that would not be on the mind of a soldier the first hand to preserve the ecosystem around him. But then it is an important component. The ecocide is an important component of war, and everyone understands that. So how do we fix this on the international arena level, and how do we fix this just in general in the minds of people, especially when there's always going to be something more pressing than these more like global but very important questions? Yeah.
So a hugely important and really complicated question. The answer in brief is twofold. Firstly, as I've already said, you've got to convince people that the danger is as real as I've portrayed it to be, and the consequences of not acting are vastly worse than whatever it takes to act in the first instance. Secondly, give people stuff for free that they didn't have beforehand. The creation of the International Environmental Commission, which I call ECOCOM for short in the book, will require, amongst other things, excuse me, debt forgiveness for the whole of the less developed world. It will require buying vast amounts of technology and then getting local production of the same technology in all of the areas of renewable energy that everyone requires. So wind, solar, and so on. All of which has to be done extremely rapidly. So you're giving people for free the ability to withstand the effects of the crises, which in some cases are already much worse in their countries. Think of Pakistan, for example. You're not asking them to become prisoners of the international market. You're not asking them to go to the IMF or whoever for huge loans, which the wealthier countries will then profit from. You're giving it to them. You're also giving them desalination plants. Water, of course, is going to be the single most important item on the whole agenda, starting probably from this year already. As you know, we're in a severe drought. It was already evident with the Danube here last year. And it will likely continue, and even if there's some kind of abeyance for a short period of time because of necessary fluctuations in the cycle, it will get worse and worse until you can't grow stuff anymore and there's no more water in the rivers, and because there's no snow coming off the mountains and so on. So you have to convince people that things are as bad as I think they are. And then secondly, you say, but in making this transition, we're going to collectively do a lot for those who are going to be most adversely affected. And this isn't by any means only poor countries. Warming is already at above the global average in Northern Europe, for example. So it could well be that we're engaging in the same things here. I mean, certain technologies, desalination is probably the single most important. are extremely inadequately developed relative to the scale of the problem we face in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So this is where the creation of to go back to the very beginning of your question, creation of a large-scale international organization. It's not like the UN. It's a much more technical than it is a political body. Concentration of scientists working in all these areas, but particularly water supply and energy, renewable energy provision. Ensuring the coordination of wherever the cheapest source of production is, and the distribution of all of that production and the erection of new factories and so on. That's what this organization will do. If you leave it to individual nations, it's too haphazard and too slow, of course. And again, however, you could say if we had 2 centuries to do this, it would work all right. I mean, you know the old argument about imperialism. Most nations probably would have come to embrace modernity without ever having European conquerors to force it on them, because they simply go to the marketplace and see things that they wanted to have and figure out what they could trade, and eventually, we end up at the same level of civilization. But we cannot expect that kind of delay in the provision, in particular, of water supply and renewable energy sources. So we have to offer people stuff for free, and we have to say, not only is our alternative much better than what we're likely to face, it's also better than the life you're leading at the moment when the crisis is not as great as it's going to be. So it's the biggest cosmic giveaway of all time. And it has to come from the wealthiest countries who are least willing to give it, which is another paradox we might explore. Because we're the ones, effectively, who have to make the greatest sacrifice. But we're also the greatest polluters. So it's perfectly fair.
Okay. Louisa, can you then?
No, I propose something else rather than my intervention at this point. I could well make my remarks in the final sort of panel, if it is, because it's general remarks that I have.
Okay.
So
okay,
that would be allow us to go directly to follow the program. Yes.
Yeah, we're pretty soon moving into that. Okay.
May I just
Yes, sure. Jordan, and then
this is just a reflection, but what you said, that this is the unique moment in our history that when we are facing problem that threatens us with extinction. And it came to my mind that, and it might propose or offer some hope for us, that actually, at least since 1945, this is the second biggest the threat of nuclear war put the very same limitation on political action. Of course, it was a negative kind of experience because it meant that we cannot do everything we can imagine in politics. Certain things are absolutely prohibited. And now we have something that calls for a more positive kind of action. So we need to do something actively, not just to avoid certain kinds of things, but still, in some sense, at least from my point of view, the first experience was uniquely successful. So maybe there is hope for the second one. Maybe we can survive. Maybe we can just resist the temptation to push the red self-destructing button across the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously, this is the most important parallel we have to draw on in terms of secular images of the apocalypse. It doesn't help whatsoever that, of course, the threat of nuclear apocalypse comes with environmental degradation. There are a number of nuclear powers which will become uninhabitable, and are they going to use their weapons in the effort to gain someone else's territory where there is agricultural land still surviving? The answer has to obviously be yes. But aside from the whole very lengthy, 2,000 odd year theory of religious apocalypse. This is the secular vision. And of course, some descriptions of the nuclear apocalypse, nuclear winter and so on, did propose the entire species would be annihilated. So we have something to go on. And it would be very useful, actually, I think, to go back to those studies and to look at how people reacted, how they were addressed by interest groups, governments, and so on. Because the prospect is very similar in lots of ways.
Yes.
My question is very much into the links, but goes a bit further down the road. So, assuming that mass starvation and like mass human death had forced had made the conditions for the global regime that you're proposing to emerge, and say some of the policies are currently are being implemented, right? Then it's a bit of an ethical and policy question. Then imagine there's a state that has a proven track record of surviving such turmoil and has large reserves of natural resources and have proven to be resilient to external market shocks and has a nuclear weapons arsenal, for example. And that state somehow achieves some sort of an equilibrium, and then it sort of enacts a sort of an autarky within it, so it's not exactly dependent on the redistribution of those technologies. And this state sort of, in the sort of tragedy of the common situation, the state now sees that these policies are having a good impact, right? And it seems that the Earth might be safe, and it now refuses to cooperate, and now completely indulges in the usage and overusage of the resources because all of the other bigger countries will handle it for it. So would the regime have to enforce then the compliance? Would they have to go to war with them? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a very interesting scenario. I think the answer to this is, of course, that we'll look for consent rather than coercion. That's the first part of the answer here. The second part of the answer is, can we really envision in a world where warming has reached, let's say, 3 degrees Celsius, which is plausible within 30 years, maybe even 20? Can we imagine that one part of the world will be that much safer than all the rest of the world? And if it is, where exactly would it lie? It's not going to be any of the higher regions of the world because warming is actually greater in those regions. It's not going to be anywhere in the north because warming also is larger there. The effects of the warming of the ocean, which is the most immediate indication we have now of the fact that the catastrophe this year is getting much more intense, are felt throughout the entire world. So it's possible that very small pockets, I would say, rather than posing this as a kind of image or narrative about a small nation state, a kind of, say, Switzerland, where there won't be any snow, of course, in 20, 30 years. Think of it rather as a very small scale community instead, maybe a few thousand people rather than a few million. I know this isn't the scenario you presented, but here there is a possibility of a small degree of opt-out in very local, isolated conditions. But it's not going to happen for very long because the temperature keeps rising, of course, if we hadn't solved the problem everywhere else. Nowhere is going to be free from the effects. And of course, the further away when you're up in the mountains, the less access you're going to have to water anyway, because we'll be relying on seawater transformed into fresh water. And if you haven't got access any longer to glaciers, to snow, and so on, then that scenario is out too. Small islands, not really a survival venue here either. So I think, the general thrust of the question you asked is really about how we bring everybody on board voluntarily, rather than just saying, this is the way it is. We now have, all the great superpowers on board. You have to join us, which is not as implausible, done by a small amount of coercion. Let me give you just one example, which I think is the most important. The abolition of offshore banking, right? There are multiple trillions, amongst the 300 or so trillion that we require, are held offshore in secret bank accounts. in the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands, various other locations. Now, it's most unlikely that these territories are simply voluntarily going to say to us, we want you to shut up shop overnight. We want immediate, first of all, transparent access to all these accounts. We are freezing the international financial transfer system, so nothing leaves those accounts to go somewhere else. It's not unreasonable for us then to say to these countries, you either go along with this, or we're going to embargo you entirely. You will have no trade, internal, external. In a few days, that particular battle is won without the necessity for a drop of blood being shed. I think that's the very first hurdle, because of course, everything I've talked about is immensely expensive. And most countries don't have the funds. We have to go to the very wealthy in the wealthiest countries. That's where the money is concentrated, and that's where initially it has to come. Now, there probably aren't any economists here, but I haven't worked out what the economic repercussions are of the kind of scenario that I've outlined here. I mean, some people could quite plausibly suggest, well, you cause an overnight collapse in the world economy if you freeze the international financial transfer system and you introduce the abolition of offshore accounts entirely. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But what's the alternative? It's complete annihilation. So there will be some tough choices, and there is coercion in this. We just have to do it in the most humane possible way.
Okay, thank you very much. Probably it would have been nicer to finish on a more optimistic note. Sorry, the situation, optimism often just doesn't help us in this situation.